Well, good evening and welcome to part two, I guess we'll call it. For those of you who were here last evening, I think it's a privilege that we have this weekend to have Marcus with us. Marcus comes to us from Holmes County, Ohio. He's the executive director of the Amish and Mennonite Heritage Center and the Ohio Amish Library in Berlin, Ohio. He's the author of Cathedrals, Castles, and Caves, which I think there's copies back on the table for $20 if you're interested. A book about Amish and Mennonite beginnings. Marcus graduated with a bachelor's degree from Ohio State University. He has a master's degree from Yale, and he just has a passion for the Mennonite culture. And I think if you listen to him, if you're here last evening, you'll probably hear it come through this evening, his passion for teaching and for history. And I wasn't here last evening, but I did go back, and all these services will be streamed, and you'll be able to watch them from Allensville's Mennonite Church's YouTube page. If you go to YouTube and you type in Allensville Mennonite Church, you'll find our page there, and you'll be able to go back and watch any of these services again. And so I did that this morning, just to kind of keep myself up to speed, and was just reminded and grabbed by this history that we have as Anabaptists, and that in those beginning, the passion and the conviction that guided those early believers. And tonight, I think as we get maybe more into the persecution side of things, those convictions hold even in the face of persecution. One of the things that I heard Marcus say last evening that's just been resonating in my mind is, in thinking about history and why we study history, is in part we're looking at kind of the redemption story, that God was the same God then is the same God that we serve now and will be forever, in this redeeming process that we find ourselves in. The other piece of that has sticking with me, I think came maybe in the Q&A session or at the end of your talk, Marcus, where you challenged us to consider the times that we live in and how they may not be very different from those early times 500 years ago that sparked that movement. And so I've just kind of been thinking about that. You know, we tend to look around and think that, man, we really live in some strange and unprecedented times, but people are people. I mean, they were people 500 years ago. We're still people today. And, Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. And while there's some new challenges, I just kept thinking of that saying that we're probably familiar with: if you fail to remember history, you're doomed to repeat it, or something like that. Those who fail to learn from history. And so I think it's just really beneficial for us this weekend as we look back over history and consider the times that we live in now in comparison to the times then, and how people were responding to God and being led by God. So looking forward to what you have to share, Marcus, and we're going to give you the floor, but let me just open us with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump right in. Father God, we thank you for this evening, for the opportunity we have to be gathered here in this place again this evening. Thank you for Marcus and his willingness to be here this weekend, for his passion and his desire for the Amish and Mennonite and Anabaptist history, and his gifting in teaching it and in communicating it. And so, God, teach us what it means to live wisely in this day that we find ourselves in as followers of Jesus, with the same kind of passion and conviction that we see from those early believers that sparked that movement 500 years ago. As we follow the same God and Jesus today, may we be led by him as we study and as you are revealed to us in your word. Invite your Spirit to be ministering and active among us as we listen and we learn from history. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be with you. I had a really good day. Do you realize what a beautiful place you live in? It is beautiful here. I had the opportunity to drive around a bit, meet some people. I've also figured out that, like Holmes County, we don't have white toppers and black toppers and yellow toppers, but we have Swartz and Troopers and Danners and Old Order and New Order and New Order Christian Fellowship and Abe Troyer. You know, we have all these segmented of Amish and Mennonites. There's about every stripe you can figure out. And sometimes we are a little embarrassed by that. We're no different than other denominational groups. Lutherans have as many divisions as we do. Interestingly enough, though, one thing you need to think about is because of our belief, our Anabaptist ideal that the locus, the place, the center of church authority, the center of religious authority is the group of believers who gather together locally, you, Allensville, wherever you go to church, Providence, where I go to church, we interpret the scriptures together. And that we figure out how to live in today's world together as this small group of believers. And so each, as Anabaptism developed in Europe, it took on many different flavors in many different places, and they couldn't always get along. Sebastian Frank is not an Anabaptist, but he wrote and said, they have as many different theologies as there are leaders. Because each small group believed that it was their call to live the New Testament, and they looked at it together and decided how to live. So it has this kind of independent flavor, and so it looks a little different as it develops. Somebody asked today, how did you become so interested in history? Well, I mean, how can you not be interested in history? Yeah? It's stories. So when I was 7 years old, well, let me tell you something. I do not go to Walmart much. I go under pressure. I was at our local Walmart in Millersburg, and I met an older gentleman, and he had on quite strong-smelling cologne. I could smell him, and it took me back. And I had this flashback. When I smelled his cologne, it's weird, I know. When I was 7 years old, my folks, we were Amish, Old Order Amish, and we lived on a country road, and one day somebody knocked on our door, and it was a salesman. And I still remember how he looked. He was wearing a blue this is 1975 or 6. He was wearing a blue double knit suit, and his tie only came to about here. And it was not because the tie wasn't long enough, it was because the stomach was too big for the tie. Anyway, you get the idea. And he was wearing the same cologne that this man in the Walmart was wearing, and it took me back to that moment. He swindled my parents into buying a set of books. And a few weeks later, the UPS man dropped off this large box, and my mother dragged it in, and she opened it up, and I thought I went to heaven. It started with A. It was World Book Encyclopedias, and I thought you were supposed to read them. So I started with A. So I know more about aardvarks and zebras, Adas. My parents gave me the gift of reading. And reading opened doors. And when I was 13, my parents left the Amish for a more restrictive Mennonite church, a really, really conservative Mennonite church. The problem was they didn't permit radio, and I loved the Cleveland Indians. And I had a hidden transistor radio, and I listened to a perfect game that Lenny Barker pitched, but could never talk about it because I wasn't supposed to have the radio. It was problematic. Anyway, and I walked away. I was baptized young in that church, 13 or 14, and wasn't well prepared and walked away from Jesus. But I kept reading. And when I was 18 and 19, I came upon some books of the Anabaptist story. I began to read them. And the stories of these people are what brought me back to the place where I wanted to embrace Jesus and follow him. So this is really personal for me because this is a part of my journey into being a follower of Jesus today. Now, I do have a favorite Anabaptist. She is right here. I asked her permission to use a picture. Some of you asked. My wife is named Norita, Norita. We have been married almost 34 years. God has chosen to not give us children, but we have cared for many people's children. For about 10 or 15 years, we lived just south of here in Fulton County at the Sharon Mennonite Bible Institute, and I taught there along with Yuri Sharp and some others. And then we moved back to Ohio. Here is the trouble in our household. I did not ask his permission. He'd be glad to give it, but anyway, this is our puppy. His name is Theodore Roosevelt Yoder. We've always named our pets after presidents. So my wife and I are both historians. So later in life, we went back to university with the idea of perhaps teaching after university. And as I entered the history program at Ohio State, I really fell in love with Anabaptist history again. And I was blessed with a really good advisor there. And he really pushed me to think about religious history. Now, he said, you will not get a job in your field, but if you love it this much, you should study it. And I decided, we had a good business at that point. It started a bulk food store in Delhi. What else? In a city. My wife is from a bulk food family. And so it started a business, it was thriving, and we were both going to Ohio State. I graduated in 2010, so it's not that long ago. And she graduated in 2011. And at the end of our time there, our advisor came to us and said, I think you should go to grad school. You should study a little more. And so we have a really good life, and we thought, we were pastoring, and we thought, why would we want to leave? But we kind of, on a whim, applied to Yale and to St. Andrews in Scotland and thought, we'll let God decide for us where we go or if we go, because one of us isn't going to one place and the other to the other. And then we were accepted in both places, both of us. So we still had to choose, but Yale offered more money. And so we ended up in New Haven. Early in 2013, we moved there and came back home to Holmes County then in 2015. A bit of our journey. And at Yale, she studied women and within Anabaptism and their role and agency. Last night I talked about the social equality that the Anabaptists called for, this kind of space where there is you're not nobility or peasant, you're not, and they would have argued that women have space to operate within the churches. When the Catholics had space for women to operate as nuns in convents, when the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe, or Northern Europe, many of the convents were closed in Lutheran and Reformed areas, and women lost their ability to give in church settings very well within the Protestant Reformed circles. But within Anabaptism, women did really have a space to operate. And for instance, I studied, I'm really interested in why people move, so I studied immigration and migration of Anabaptists. Like, why do you move? Why do you pick up your young family and move, which we'll cover tomorrow morning? But my professor at Yale told me, we were having a discussion once. His name is Bruce Gordon, and he's a leading Swiss Reformation historian. And he said that women, he was talking to Norita about this, women in this time period, in the 1500s, women could not testify in court because men thought they were too dumb to testify in court. They were chattel of men. But the Anabaptist women had to testify in court. And so we have all their court records, which gives us windows into it. A third of the martyrs in the martyr's mirror are women. And because the authorities said, with your own mouth, you've been preaching in our villages and ruining people's lives. So with your own mouth, you're going to condemn yourself at your trial. No one can speak for you. And so women had a very active role in Anabaptism and have through the years. This is a scene from Behalt, the painting that we work with every day at the Amish Mennonite Heritage Center. This is the first baptism. We talked about this last night. And again, I want to point us back and think about the power structure, the piety of the people, the plague, the printing press, those kinds of events that happen. And particularly in a world that is changing so fast. Their world is changing so fast. They write about all this change. And there are so many similarities to our world. Again, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself. We don't go back and live in that time period, but humanity is humanity, and humanity is as broken as it has always been. And so the power structures begin to dominate and they break apart. The average life expectancy of a democracy is 200 years in history. So you have these turnings in human history, and oftentimes turnings are led by manners of communication, how people communicate. And so the printing press sets off this kind of revolution and reformations throughout Europe. And in the same way that AI and the digital revolution, we've only begun to feel the impact of that in our world, and we're going to see much more of that. That should not scare us, Jesus followers. It should embolden us to tell the story of something that does not change. Jesus. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So the early Anabaptists clung to that. So, like I said last night, this is a religious revolution, it's a political revolution, it's a social revolution. And we talk a lot about the religion, but we've not talked as much about the social. And again, this is a world in which there are so many inequalities. You have the nobility who have everything at their fingertips, including the life of the peasants under them. And you have the peasants. And the Anabaptists preached and taught that there should be no such differences in the kingdom of Jesus. There is an equality there where we are all alike. We are all on the same level. And it appeals to the peasants. And it spreads rapidly through Europe. Here are some of the core ideas. I'm interested in this because Harold Bender first espoused this, but I've thought about this a great deal. So as Jesus followers, we have to think about our relationship with God and Jesus, our relationship with the Trinity, our relationship with each other as brothers and sisters, and our relationship with the world around us. And the early Anabaptists believed that at its essence, the relationship with the Trinity, with Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit, is one of us being a disciple of Jesus. We are his disciples. And so at its essence, Christianity is following Jesus in radical trust. It is not about just merely saying the sinner's prayer. It's about following Jesus. And so they return to the Gospels. They say the Gospels are the model. So you look at the Gospels. There's a reason that, I don't know what the Amish do here, but the Holmes County Amish, I went through their lectionary. 85% of their preaching is from the Gospels. And we should think about returning to that a little more in our circles, because it's the model of Jesus. We return to that. They believed, for instance, that the Sermon on the Mount was intended to be followed in their world and their time. That Jesus' kingdom had come down to earth, and he was making a beachhead into Satan's territory, and his followers are given the mandate to take that into all the world. That's compelling. And I think what we should do is call people to that radical trust and discipleship. Then they said the Christian community is bound to share that discipleship in giving and receiving with each other. That's about a relationship with each other. By the way, when they write about church, they don't often write about the church of Jesus as in the big church, all the believers of Jesus across the world. They're writing to individuals, gatherings of disciples. Allensville, Locust Grove, I don't know all the names of the churches here. They're talking about that individual group of believers together. So when they talk about church, they're talking about giving and receiving with your brothers and sisters who you see every Sunday when you gather together. And that extends into mutual aid. It extends into correction and admonishment and discipline. It extends across all of our lives. So we should be people who give and love each other enough to give and receive. By the way, the giving is the easy part. Receiving is the hard part on all of those things. Admonition and correction. Well, giving isn't always easy there, but anyway. But it's hard to receive that sometimes from people who are more broken than you, at least you think they are. And it's also hard to receive financial aid. And Narita and I have been in numerous occasions in our lives where we've had to rely on our brothers and sisters. But there is something powerful that happens when we do that. And then that discipleship is expressed to the world around us through love and peace. Very quickly, they had opportunities to test that. And there are elements of Anabaptism that begins to move towards using the sword. Balthasar Hubmaier is one of them who initiates that, but he very quickly gets folded up into the Lutheran Church. The mainline group of Anabaptists believe that it is better to give life than to take life. That the seed of life is given by God in every human, and therefore a piece of God resides in every human. And how can we take that life, extinguish that life in any way? And again, that's easy for us to sit here in Allensville when we have relative peace to talk about. It's much harder when you're being persecuted or your family is being harried through the land. And very quickly, because of their beliefs, primarily all three of these. So they would not swear oaths. When I was a little boy growing up, I thought swearing oaths was not cursing when you hit your thumbnail with a hammer. But it is about swearing of allegiance. It's about allegiance. And every nobleman in that time period had the right to bring all his subjects together and ask them to swear allegiance to him. I swear allegiance to my Lord. And if he had any ideas that there was kind of a rebellion or revolt going on, he would call all his subjects together and force them to do it. And those who were not willing to do that, he put to death. And the Anabaptists said, we cannot swear allegiance to an earthly leader. Our true leader is Jesus, and he has our total allegiance. And in a world that is politically segmented like theirs was, to say, I choose none of those parties, I choose Jesus, it is radical. And for that, they're hunted and harried through the land. And very quickly, they're pushed, they're pressured. This is the village of Schleitheim, where in 1527, a group of Anabaptists meet together here at Schleitheim, and they write the first confession of faith. It is not a complete confession of faith. These are the issues that separate them from their world around them. First of all, they said on baptism, it should be adults. We should only do adult baptism. I've divided into 3 B's and 4 S's so I can remember it. The 7 articles. So the ban, or the baptism, the ban, and again, the ban is not about, it's been abused in all circles, but particularly those of us who have Amish roots, the ban is almost a bad word. I know what it's like to go to your grandparents' home, and there's a table set for 50 people, and there's another table set off to the side in another room for you and your mom and dad and your sister. I know what that feels like. That's not, there is a strong division that happens. And it should not be over issues of which church we go to. It should be about issues of sin. But the ban is about keeping the disciples pure. And it's not bad. It's been abused, but so has a lot of other things, including food. And you seem to, I enjoy it as well as you do. So again, just because something's been abused doesn't mean it's bad. So the ban should be used by churches. In my 27 years of church leadership, I have used it twice. And again, I was careful not to call it the ban, but we The scriptures talk about turning someone over to Satan because they're making choices. And we simply had a simple service. It was the hardest service I've ever led in my life, where we turned someone over to the powers of darkness because of the choices they were making. So it's about keeping the church pure. Bread, communion. They said communion should be for the believers who are baptized. Separation, again, that's separation from the world in the sense of not being part of the system of the world. The sword, we're very clear on the sword. It is outside the kingdom of Jesus. Shepherds, interesting enough, in 1527, they said the church leaders should be paid, should be taken care of by the church so they can preach and lead the church, and then the swearing of oaths that we talked. So these are the things that kind of separate them. Anabaptism spreads, and it spreads very rapidly. If you see down at the bottom here is Zurich. I better not try to push buttons I don't know anything about here, but if you look down at the bottom there is Zurich. That's where the first parts of the movement began, but it spreads east into Nikolsburg, into the Moravian area, and there it takes a distinctly unique flavor. In the 1530s, a group of 100 or between 100 and 150 Anabaptists are driven out of the city of Philipsburg, and when they're at the edge of the city, they're banished with what they could only carry, and that they had everything taken from them because of their decision to follow Jesus in this way. At the edge of the town, they spread a blanket on the ground, and they put all their possessions on that one blanket. 150 people and put all their possessions on one blanket. They pulled those possessions and bought a piece of ground and lived in common. And a few years later, they have a prominent leader named Jacob Hutter, hat maker, and they become known as the Hutterites or Hutterites. And it's also in that area along the Danube River where in 1535 a group of Anabaptists are imprisoned there, including a man named Hans Betz. Hans Betz is one of my heroes in this time period. We know so little about him, except that he had preached so prolifically, the authorities had burned holes in both his cheeks so he couldn't get air into his mouth, and so he wrote songs and helped smuggle those songs out of prison. They're ballads, and they're ballads about the power of Jesus to keep you in times of real darkness. And those ballads are still sung. They'll be sung tomorrow morning in the valley here by the Amish people. They're in this book, a very good devotional reading if you can read German. Just because they use it shouldn't mean that we shouldn't look at it and look at it. They're stories, they're ballads, they're Flugschriften. Remember Flugschriften from last night? There's pamphlets that are printed and they spread prolifically, but they're stories of the power of Jesus to keep you in times of utter darkness. And Hans Betz, sitting in prison in the dungeon at Passau, writes these songs about the power of Jesus. And when you read them, it's like, oh, it fits our world. It's because he's human. So it spreads there. As it spreads north into Strasbourg and Worms, I love city names. In German, the W is pronounced with a B. So you've seen this Diet of Worms. It's a historical, a diet means a meeting. Diet, it's actually Diet of Worms, but Diet of Worms sounds good too. But in Worms, it spreads, and then it spreads up the Rhine and into the Netherlands, and particularly Amsterdam. And there it takes on a little more of an apocalyptic flavor. So again, when you're being persecuted, don't be too harsh on these people. They're talking a lot about Jesus' return and the coming of Jesus and the coming rule of Jesus on earth. And as it spreads north, and again, they become the most hunted and harried people in all of Europe. Zwingli said, dealing with the Catholics is child's play as compared to dealing with these dreaded Anabaptists. I just read an account recently of a nobleman who said, I would rather fight the entire war that we've been fighting with the Turks than to deal with the Anabaptists in my kingdom. They are insidious. And he goes on and describes their insidiousness. They were loving the population. They were taking bread to the poor. They were helping other people. And they were also spreading the gospel of Jesus and baptizing people. So at the same time all of this is happening, there is pressure on Europe, on Christendom, Christian Europe, from the southeast. And it is the Muslim fundamentalists, they're known as Turks in that time period. And again, they're being slowly being radicalized, and as they're moving north, they put a lot of pressure on Europe. And Europe is in constant fear of the infidels, they call them, the Turks. By the way, Michael Sattler, who wrote the Schleitheim Confession of Faith, in 1527, that we talked the 7 points there, he was a up-and-coming Catholic churchman who was a prior in a monastery, could have had his life of ease, and he began to read the scriptures. And as he read the scriptures, he became touched by them and heard about Anabaptism and left and married a nun named Margarita. And they became influential leaders, but they're captured. Actually, at Schleitheim, when he writes the Confession of Faith, he's a very able student, a teacher. And he writes it for the group. They agree to it, but there is somebody who gives them up. And as they're seen leaving the city, and when they're seen leaving the city, Michael, because he's a leader, is captured. And he is put into prison. He and Margarita are captured. He's put into prison. And he is horribly tortured to try to recant his faith. He does not. But he is on trial. And the inquisitors ask him, is it true that you said that if you were to fight, you would rather fight on the side of the Turks than on the side of the Christians? And Michael Sattler said, it is so. He said, because they are Turks of the flesh, but you are Turks of the heart. That's a mouthful, because Michael Sattler is saying, if I were to fight, I would rather fight on the side of the Muslim infidels than I were to fight on the side of Christianity, because Christianity was never designed to be one that fights, a religion that fights. Those are powerful words. Now, are they bold? Maybe too bold? Yeah, they might be. Michael was tied to a ladder, and a bag of gunpowder was put around his neck, and they built a large fire, and they gave him one last chance to recant. And they were going to tip the ladder up and over and into the fire. And if they would have recanted, they would have very mercifully simply just cut his head off. And they bring a priest in to give him the opportunity to recant. And when the priest comes up, Michael, instead of recanting, offers him forgiveness for what they're about to do. Now, I ask you, which is more powerful? The force that they used on his body, or the forgiveness he offered them? At the end of the day, we know his story because he chose to do something extremely unusual: forgive his enemies. And he did. His wife, by the way, Margarita, the empress of the region, was so touched by her story, she came to her prison cell and said, I can help you get out of here. And Margarita said, no. She was put into a burlap bag and drowned in the Neckar River. These are stories that I read as a teenager. So, but as it moves north, so there's always this pressure, but as it moves north into Amsterdam, it takes on a distinctly apocalyptic flavor where they talk a lot about the Lord's return. It also spreads east from Amsterdam into the North German city of Münster. Now, this is the modern North German city of Münster. They have one of the largest hot air balloon festivals in the world at Münster. I've been to Münster once. Anyone here been to Münster? Yeah, Lamar and Lois and Heaven and a few others. If you note, you can see that there's a line of trees that kind of encircles the city. That's the old city walls. And so it's an old city. It's a cathedral city, so a bishop lives there. But one of the events of Anabaptism takes place there. Now, I did not know much about this event. In my early years of studying Anabaptism, I never heard much about Münster. I read a little bit about it, and I never paid much attention to it. Well, when we went to Yale, I was in a class. One of my first classes was a class called Transitional Moments in Western Christianity. And it was by the most delightful professor that I had in any of my college years. She was a Scottish woman with a beautiful brogue, and you could just listen to her speak with her brogue. She was so fabulous. And I noticed on the syllabus that she was going to talk about the Radical Reformation. You know, she talked about Polycarp. She looked at all these moments in Western Christianity that have been influential. And towards the end, it went to 1600. Towards the end, she was going to talk about the Radical Reformation. And that day, I showed up early. And normally in college, I did not sit up front. As a Mennonite preacher, I always have to sit up front. So in college, I didn't. I sat in the back. And you look less like a fool if you sit in the back and say something dumb than if you sit up front and say something. That was my premise. Not very good ideas, but anyway. So I came and sat pretty far up front that day. 7:45 class in the morning. I sat there and I thought, this is my day. We're going to hear about my people today. You know, this is my thing. And she starts and she talks a little bit, a minute or two, about the nature of Zurich and its baptism and so on. She said, but when you really want to capture Anabaptism in the 1500s in Europe, I want us to move to Munster. And she began to talk about this North German city of Munster and the story of Munster. And I began to slide further down my seat. And after the class, and you'll hear why in a little bit, after the class was over, I did not know what to do. I mean, it felt so unfair. An hour and 5 minutes of class time, and she spends nearly all at the very end, she said, now, not all the Anabaptists in Europe followed the route of Munster, but Munster has impacted much of our world today. And she talked a little bit about Menno, Simons. And I thought, so I went to her office right after class and knocked on the door, and she said, Marcus, is that you? She said, I thought you might show up. Oh, really? I said, that just felt really unfair to me. And she said, have you ever studied Munster and its impact? I said, well, not to the level you have, obviously. And she said, I'd like for you to write your final paper on that. That's not what I want to write my final paper on. But she's a professor, and she said, you really need to think about it. Your people need to think about this. Because when you look back into history, and you only ever look at the good in history, or what worked, there's a little bit of a problem with that. Because every group of people has a propensity towards something. And I think your people have a propensity towards Munster. And so what happens in the 1530s, as you can tell, it is east of Amsterdam. It's nearly along the Rhine. The Rhine is that light blue line that goes up through there. The Anabaptists are being persecuted, and they find some freedom in Munster, and they move there. Now, they have a really engaging preacher in Munster, the Anabaptists do, named Bernard Roetman. And there is also a merchant there, Bernard Knipperdoling, who is a strong leader there, and they kind of open up the city for Anabaptists. And by 1534, there are several Anabaptists elected to the city council. And by late 1534, they're the majority on the city council. And suddenly, Anabaptists from all across the German-speaking territories are coming to Munster. They're coming to the city where they're going to find freedom. They have this engaging preacher who's preaching about the time of Jesus coming, the new heavens coming down to earth. And in fact, they begin to call Munster the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. Now, what do you do with all the Lutherans that are stuck in the city with these poor Anabaptists? So they try to figure out what to do with them, and they actually take swords and drive the Lutherans out of the city at the point of a sword in a sleet storm. They're driven out. And suddenly you have a pure city, all Anabaptists. And by now, there's this man named Jan Matthias, who's a baker, who comes to kind of rises to the top as a leader. He's the political leader. Bernard Roetman's the religious leader, and the city has found its space. Anabaptists are coming there. Authorities are trying to stop them. In fact, it is one of the few times where Catholics and Protestants agree to band together, and they lay siege to the city. So the city's under siege. No one can leave or come. And Matthias leads the city, and he begins to lead the city in some strange ideas. For instance, he says you can no longer lock your doors. And you have to share all your food, especially with the leaders. And they are kind of the privileged elite. They can go into anyone's house they want, and they begin to do some strange things. And then, by now it's 1535. This is only 10 years after the baptisms in Zurich. And it is, Anabaptism is sweeping the German-speaking areas of Europe. It is conservatively 25% of German-speaking citizens of Europe are rebaptized during this time period. So it has the potential to absolutely revolutionize Europe. And you know, we need this kingdom. And as it's happening, towards Easter of 1535, Jan Matthias says he and his 12 disciples, there is a problem there when a man has 12 disciples who isn't Jesus. He and his 12 disciples are going to single-handedly be able to conquer the bishop's forces. There's 9,000 men, good fighting men, arrayed against the city all the way around it. And he is going to go out there, he and these 13 men, and they're going to single-handedly conquer the bishop's forces. They go out on Easter morning of 1535 and promptly get their heads cut off. His protege, a 24-year-old tailor named Jan van Leyden, takes over his space, marries his widow the same day, and begins to institute polygamy, but only for leaders. If you have a beautiful wife, and one of the leaders wants to marry her, simply has the husband killed. Doesn't sound very Anabaptist, does it? This is St. Lambert's Cathedral, which is in the middle of the city. Unfortunately, the picture I took there in 2017 didn't come out very well. But somewhere a few months later, somebody gives up the city, and the bishop's forces end up breaking down the gates and coming in. They immediately kill all the men. Well, they put the three leaders on trial, Roetman, Knipperdoling, and Jan van Leyden. They put them on trial and condemn them to death, kill the other men, allow any women who are willing to recant and children to leave with what they could carry. And the city is absolutely, the Anabaptists in the city are absolutely devastated. They take the bodies of the three principal leaders. So here's a bit about the city. I should have told you this. It's a mid-sized city, so there's about 15,000 people. And the guilds, which are like trade unions, are locked in struggle with the bishops. So here are some of the things that happen as the Anabaptists take over. For instance, they burn books. Whenever there are book burnings, we should all be a little careful. Whenever there are book bans, we should all be careful, because who decides? Now, I'm not suggesting that we just have this openness or anything like. I'm not saying that. But whenever there is an authoritarian power that says we have to ban certain kinds of literature so our people can't hear another idea, then we're in trouble. There's sexual deviancy, there's atrocities against minors, particularly women, and anyone who wasn't Anabaptist. This is an account. So what the authorities did is allowed the women to leave and killed all the men, and then they put the bodies of the three leaders and hung them on the cathedral spire, St. Lambert's Cathedral, hung them on the cathedral spire as a warning against all of Europe about these dreaded Anabaptists. In 2017, we led a tour to Europe, small family group, and we went to Munster. It's my first time there, and I went in, and in my broken high German, there was a caretaker at the cathedral came out, and I said, in German, can you tell me about those cages? And he said in perfect English back, he said, are you Amish or Mennonite? And I said, I am. He said, that's the only people who ask about the cages. But anyway, those cages are still hanging there today. Now, here is an interesting thing. So when I began to work on this under my professor's direction, I discovered something, that when this happened, suddenly Anabaptists went into, you just don't hear anything more about it. They went quiet. They just went quiet. They became the quiet in the land. Baptisms cut way down. No, it's not all bad. And 175 years later, in a strange place across the ocean in Boston, Massachusetts, which had been settled by the Puritans. In Boston, Massachusetts, Boston is Puritan, New England is Puritan, and the first church in Boston, the one where Paul Revere would, 100 years later, hang his lantern in, is Puritan church. Pennsylvania is settled by Quakers. Quakers believe in the freedom of religion and preach, and the Puritans do not. Puritans don't believe in the Puritan New England. There should be a fence around all of New England, they said, to keep it pure. And some Quakers preached their way north from Pennsylvania. 2 Quaker preachers. And they're caught by the Puritans, and they're hung to death on the Boston Square. This is in New England in the 1670s. And John Norton, who is the preacher, the preacher at the First Congregational Church in Boston, writes a 53-page tract defending the right to hang the Quakers. Because, he says, if we don't stop the Quakers from preaching in New England will become what Europe was under the dreaded Anabaptists in Munster. And suddenly this specter of what the Anabaptists did when we went bad, it impacts an entire world later. And if you think that this is not possible, if you think that this doesn't happen in today's world, about 15, 20 years ago, a group of Amish in eastern Ohio, led by a strong leader who controlled all the money and essentially slept with any woman in his settlement that he wanted to, would beat people with 2x4s and put them in horse stalls and imprison them in there. This is an Amish bishop. His name is Sam Mullet. And he begins to react to some of the other Amish and takes scissors, unfortunately buys scissors in Pennsylvania and crosses state lines with the scissors, which makes it a federal crime because the weapon used is cross state lines, so the FBI could get involved. And he goes to some other Amish bishops and cuts their beards and their hair. By the way, if you don't think that's traumatic, think about this. I happen to know one of those men. 9 o'clock at night, a pickup and a horse trailer pulls in, and a large group of men break into their house and hold him, he's in bed already, and hold him down in his own bed and cut his hair and his beard off. That's traumatic. Sam is arrested, and as the truth comes out about Sam, it looks so much like Munster. And I argue that when we're not actively caring for each other, following Jesus, and reaching out, when we're more intent on setting up power structures and cities under our control here on earth, we become like Munster. And so there's a warning in all of this. And at the end of the semester, I had to eat my words. I went back to my professor and I said, thank you for forcing me into thinking about this. So when we think about our role and our space in our world today, it is not to do this kind of thing. And this effectively stops the spread of Anabaptism. It gave rise to a different approach, but it also caught the attention of a young Dutch priest named Menno Simons. He read about this. By the way, his brother Peter had joined the Anabaptists and was going to Munster and was caught in the old cloister on his way there and was beheaded there because the authorities did not want them to go. And so when you think about the map, Menno lives north of Amsterdam, up in that area. He was born in 1496, so he's in his 30s in this time, 40s in this time period. Begins to read the scriptures, and by 1536 he's rebaptized, and very quickly he's ordained into the Anabaptist church, and he becomes the person who travels up and down these areas and brings these Anabaptist churches who are devastated by Munster. And by the way, what Munster did is give license again to the authorities to go through the land and wipe out any Anabaptist. And Menno is able to bring that struggling church together. And Menno has this wonderful way of approaching life. By the way, I used to think that Menno was a stuffy old preacher that no one would ever want to visit with. And I tried to lay that down and read his writings a little differently. And when I did that, I suddenly found a vibrant Jesus follower who loves to eat roasted meat and drink. He says, you accuse me of drinking wine when you have to drink beer. He said, if I get a chance to drink wine, I'm going to. I'm not suggesting you go drink wine. I'm just saying in that time period, no one drank water because water was bad. The poor people drank watered down beer because the alcohol kept the water safe. Rich people drank wine, and so the people were accusing Menno of consorting with the rich people. He said, if I get the chance to eat roasted meat and drink wine, I'm going to. I kind of like that approach to life where you say, I'm going to enjoy life and the gifts that Jesus gave. But he says this is, and he kind of patterns this approach, that all Scripture must be interpreted according to the Spirit, the teaching, the walk, and the example of Christ and the apostles. So he's pointing us back to Jesus. And he's saying, whenever we think about how we interpret Scripture, how we think about living today, go back to Jesus and think about Jesus. Now, this is his life verse. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And when you think about Menno and you think about these early followers of Jesus, what does it take to give your life for Jesus? What does it take? Well, it takes a love for Jesus. But it also takes a love for your fellow man. And it takes a willingness to say that there is something bigger out there, something bigger than earthly wealth, something bigger than life, and that's Jesus. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And it's him we follow. Now, Menno actually died a natural death. He was hunted and harried all his life. He was an engaging man who was able to bring the people together. And one of the queens of the region began to call the Menno's people, she began to call the followers, the Anabaptists, Menno's light. And then soon Mennonists, and then Mennonites. Now, I actually think that Menno would turn over in his grave and say, no, don't call yourself Mennonites. You're Jesus followers. But, it's our name, so we'll live with it. But he's a very prominent leader, and he comes as a result of Munster. So there's always good there's redemption in the bad. So Mennonites come before Amish, just so you know that. This is something we have to teach everyone. Mennonites were known as Mennonites in Europe before the Amish. The Amish come along in 1700, so they're relatively late on the spectrum. But I just want to point us to another story that happens about the same time, a few years later. Many of you know the story of Dirk Willems. Do you know the story of Dirk Willems? Dirk Willems is a Mennonite preacher, Anabaptist preacher, who lives in just south of Amsterdam. And he's a thin, light man, small man, but he's imprisoned for his faith and for his preaching. And when he's in prison, he's made even thinner and lighter by his diet in prison. And he's condemned to death. And he knows his death is coming. And one day, the opportunity to escape happens. And Dirk escapes prison. But he's seeing. This is the scene that Heinz Gogel, our artist, painted. And as he's running away, a small group of Taifa Yalgal, Anabaptist hunters. There's a bounty on Anabaptist heads. You can turn them in to the authorities and get money. So they're an entire job of hunting Anabaptists. A Taifa Yalgal sees him and pursues him. The Taifa Yalgal is heavier, and Dirk runs across a canal or a river with thin ice. He makes it safely across, but the man pursuing him doesn't. And he falls through the ice. And Dirk turns around after hearing him ask for help and helps the man out of the ice. The man wanted to let him go. But his colleagues on the other shore said, absolutely not. And Dirk was chained to a soldier, put back into prison, and 2.5 weeks later was burned at the stake. What do you think Dirk thought in those 2.5 weeks? I wonder if I should have turned around. He had a wife and family, by the way. Don't kid yourself. Those thoughts, he's human. He's not a superhero. He's human. Those thoughts went through his head. And by the way, Dirk probably didn't think about his legacy. He did not think about that. I mean, it's not in their language much then, but he had no clue. This is almost 450 years later, that his story would ever be told. He was just faithful. Now, the decision to turn around and help his fellow man out of the river, the cold water, didn't happen that day. It happened long before that, when Dirk made the choice to follow Jesus. Dirk's story is in the Martyr's Mirror. And when our artist, Heinz Gogol, was born in the late 1920s, I went back and looked, and at 17 was drafted into Hitler's army and shot in the shoulder at the Battle of the Bulge. When he was doing his research to paint Behold, he found the story of Dirk Willems. He said, this story has so little to do with your history, but it has everything to do about who you are. And so he chose to take, this is one part of the painting that is out of order. It's not in its proper chronological space on the painting. He put it directly halfway in the painting. And it looks across the mural hall to the 10-foot-high figure of Jesus. Because Heinz felt like stories like this mirror Jesus coming to earth and giving his life for you and me. Now, we've told that story. And he said, by the way, he said, you can tell the story however you wish, except for that part of the story. Every person who walks through the mural hall deserves the right to hear that story. So we've told that story. Early in my tenure there, we had a Muslim couple. She was wearing a full burqa. You could only see her eyes. I did not give the tour. I came in afterwards to check the humidity in the mural hall, and I noticed this Muslim woman standing there, just standing there looking at Dirk Willems. And I was probably guilty of profiling. This is 5 minutes after the tour. And I finally kind of sidled up to her and I said, is everything okay? I had no clue if she could speak English. And she turned and looked at me. And if you know anything about their culture, Muslim women aren't supposed to look into the face of a man other than their husband. And she looked me right in the eyes. And she had deep, penetrating eyes. And she said, is that story true? To the best of my knowledge, it is. And she called her husband and son over. And she proceeds to tell me her story. So she said, the only Christians we know are crusaders. The Christian armies in the 1100s who painted crosses on their shields and banners and attacked her people. In 1991, in the first Desert Storm, she was a little girl living in northern Iraq. She remembers going to the local place where there was a television and seeing George Bush. God bless him. I'm not saying anything negative I'm not saying anything political here. George Bush on television saying this is a holy war, a just war. We have to rid the world of this evil man. And she saw American airmen painting God Bless America on their bombs. And one of those bombs fell on her village and killed all of her family. She has no living blood family in the world except her son. And she said, why don't we know about a Messiah that gives his life? Why don't we know about Christians who give their life? It's a legitimate question. Six years ago, my friend Elam Lapp from, I always point to what east, in Dauphin County, Amish preacher there, asked if he could bring a group of Amish young people from Lancaster and Dauphin County to visit us at Behalton, and whether we'd give them a 3.5-hour tour. He wanted actually a 4-hour tour, and I said, Elam, we can't do 4 hours. I mean, we can talk that long, but they can't sit that long. He said, well, you don't know our communion services, but, and so we settled on a 3-hour tour. 100 Amish young people. Now, we do it for the local Amish young people when they join church. We can have 800 people over 4 nights sometimes. But this was unique. It was Dauphin and Lancaster County young people with a few adults. Brought 2 buses out. And we were doing the tour, and we got to this place in the tour halfway through. At about the hour and 45-minute mark, we're going to take a short break. And we take turns. There's 3 of us guides who do those. And I was doing the one on Dirk Willems. And when I told the story of Dirk Willems, this 18-year-old Amish girl standing about 15 feet to my right here, I can picture her. She was wearing her heart-shaped covering, a purple dress, and a black apron. She was beautiful. And she began to cry. And I'm talking, not just tears running, but loudly crying. We told this story. And we were going to take a break, and we took the break, and Elam walked up to me, and he was one of those men in the world who put both his hands on my shoulders, this Amish bishop. And he said, Marcus, do you know who that girl is? No, I have no clue. He said, she's one of the survivors of the Nickel Mine school shootings. Remember 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, a man named Charlie Roberts broke into an Amish school, chased the little boys out, killed 6 little girls and wounded some others. She's one of those little girls. She has bullet scars in her body. And a few weeks later, her family, Charlie Robertson took his own life that day, but her family became internationally known for inviting the Roberts family down to their home for a meal and offering forgiveness. And the story that her father used to convince his children that they could not carry the heavy load of bitterness and anger for the rest of their lives was the story of Dirk Willems. Dirk goes to his death, not knowing that his story would ever be told. He goes to his death with his wife and children in their hometown of Aspirin, not knowing whether they'd ever be cared for. He has no clue that 450 years later. And so I just ask you this. When the people of God do unusual things in following Jesus, when we choose to give life rather than take life, when we choose to love and give to the world around us, that is the power of Jesus in our world today. And that is what is going to change our world. And when I think about history, I think about how can we honor the legacy of this. And again, it's not honoring Dirk Willems, it's honoring Jesus. Because Dirk died not for the freedom for us to wear a certain kind of clothing. Dirk died because he chose to follow Jesus and live it out in his world. I don't know that many of us will be called to give our life. But in small ways, we give our life when we care for each other. I am often reminded of probably the most famous of Menno's sayings. True evangelical faith is of such a nature it cannot lie dormant, but spreads itself out in all kinds of righteousness and fruits of love. It seeks, serves, and fears God in its inmost soul. It clothes the naked, it feeds the hungry, it comforts the sorrowful, it shelters the destitute. It aids and consoles the sad. It does good to those who do it harm. It serves those that harm it. It prays for those who persecute it. It teaches, admonishes, and judges us with the word of the Lord. It seeks those who are lost. It binds up what is wounded. It heals the sick. It saves what is strong. It becomes all things to all people. Beloved sisters and brothers, do not deviate from the doctrine and life of Christ. So the call for us as Anabaptists in today's world to follow the model of history is not to figure out how we can die for Jesus. It is to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to give to the poor, to love the people, and to begin to break down the walls that the kingdom of darkness sets up that separate us. So, the same God that was present with Dirk Willems is present here. And for that reason, we can follow him. He doesn't change. There's no mystery. Well, there's great mystery, but there is no mystery in following Jesus. You follow. Remember last night I said wisdom comes to the people of God in three ways. It comes through the Spirit, the Holy Spirit speaking to us. By the way, I actually happen to think that in the New Testament, that doesn't mean us so much individually as us as a church. It should always be tempered with that. So, and it comes in our living traditions when we celebrate baptisms, when we celebrate the Lord's Supper together. You ever think about when we celebrate the Lord's Supper that we're saying, we're together in this? And the cultural context that God has called us to live in. So wisdom comes to us in the cultural context that God has put us in. So God needed people like you and I in the 21st century I won't try to pronounce the Kisha word, but in Big Valley, Pennsylvania, you're needed here. You're here because you're here. So you should think about, as a group, and in the churches that you're part of, you should think about, what does this mean? How are we called to live in today's world? It looks different than Dirk and Menno. I don't notice many of you wearing robes or... by the way, I like this. I tell my church people at home that they're really missing out because I should wear 4-foot sleeves because I have a master's degree. That the robes that you wore, I did a little research on this. You know, when you graduate college, bachelor's degrees have 3-foot sleeves. The whole point of those in that world was that that obviously means you don't work around machinery because you'd get the sleeves into the belts and stuff. That's the point. They're scholars. When you get a master's degree, you get a 4-foot sleeve. One of my church people told us, if you want to preach in your robe that you wore for graduation, we don't mind. We'd like to take some pictures to put on Facebook, but anyway, no, I won't wear them anyway. But God has called us to live here and now, and wisdom will come to us about how to do this here and now when we ask. God bless you. Tomorrow morning I intend to talk about immigration and then kind of wrap up with saying, what does it mean for the 21st century? Adam?
I think you've given us plenty to think about, and we don't need to add or take anything away. You are invited to join us here tomorrow morning. Marcus will be speaking again, as he said, during our worship service that begins at 9:15. He'll be also speaking during our Sunday school hour that follows, that usually begins around 10:45-ish or so. There's a meal afterwards. for us to share and fellowship that way. I would mention that if you do plan to join us for the meal, would encourage you to bring something, a dish to share that will help out our hospitality team here. But encourage you to join us tomorrow morning for our worship service here and to hear Marcus continue. God bless you, and you're dismissed.